The moment I signed my name away, I felt nothing. Not grief, not fear, not the hollow ache everyone expected to see on my face. I felt the pen glide across the paper the way it had glided across 1,000 ledgers in another life, precise and unbothered, while my husband sat 2 feet away, trying not to grin like a man who just won a poker hand he didn't deserve. He thought he'd taken everything from me. He had no idea he'd just handed me something he could never take back. The courtroom smelled like old paper and cheap coffee, the kind of smell that clings to a building where people come to end things. I sat at the long table in a navy blazer I'd bought for job interviews I never went to, my hands folded in my lap the way my mother taught me. Across the aisle, Benjamin Foster sat like a man already celebrating. He'd worn his good suit, the charcoal one from the tailor on 5th, and he kept glancing at his phone under the table, probably texting his girlfriend, probably telling her it was almost over. He was getting the house. The one with the wraparound porch I'd picked out swatches for back when picking out swatches felt like building a life instead of decorating someone else's throne. He was getting the company, Foster Construction, the business I'd kept afloat through 2 recessions with spreadsheets he never bothered to read. He was getting the lake house, the investment portfolio, the cars, every account with our names stitched together after 22 years of marriage. I was getting the kids. Full custody of Ethan and Emma, 17 years old, 6 months from leaving for college, 6 months from not needing full custody of anything. My attorney, Olivia Hart, leaned toward me one last time before the judge called us to order. She'd been fighting me on this for 3 weeks, ever since I told her my plan. "Natalie," she whispered now, her pen hovering over her legal pad like she still thought there was time to stop this. "You don't have to do this." I looked at her and I meant it when I said, "That's exactly why I'm doing it." She didn't understand. Not yet. Nobody in that room understood except maybe the man who drafted a document 17 years earlier and never told me it would matter this much. Judge Ramirez was a woman in her 50s with reading glasses pushed low on her nose and the flat, unimpressed tone of someone who'd seen every version of this room 1,000 times. She looked at me over the file, not unkindly, the way you look at someone standing too close to a ledge. "Mrs. Foster," she said, "I need to confirm you understand what you're agreeing to. You are relinquishing your claim to nearly every marital asset, including the primary residence, the business, and all investment accounts. Is that correct?" "Yes, Your Honor. You've had adequate counsel." "I have. And this is being entered freely without coercion." "It is." Benjamin shifted in his seat beside his lawyer, and I saw it then, the thing I'd been watching for since we walked in. The corner of his mouth twitched upward, just slightly. Just enough. He thought he'd won the war without ever having to fight it, that his wife of 22 years had simply run out of will, the way water runs out of a cracked glass. His mother, Diane, sat behind him in the gallery in her Sunday pearls. And when our eyes met across the room, she smiled at me too. The same smile she'd worn at every holiday dinner for 2 decades, the one that said she'd always known I wasn't good enough for her son. Benjamin signed fast, too fast, the way people sign things they've already spent in their heads. I watched his pen move and thought about the first apartment we shared, 400 square feet above a laundromat, and how he used to fall asleep with his head on my stomach while I did the books for his father's old truck by lamplight. I thought about how far a person could travel from who they used to be and how rarely they noticed the distance until someone held up a mirror. The judge nodded, satisfied, and reached for the next folder in the stack, one I recognized from the thickness of it, the weight of paper that had been sitting in Olivia's briefcase since Tuesday. She opened it slowly, read the first page, then read it again. Benjamin didn't notice at first. He was already reaching for his phone, already halfway out of the room in his mind, probably composing the text to his girlfriend about dinner reservations. It was Diane who noticed the shift in the judge's expression, the small crease forming between her eyebrows. And I watched Diane's smile falter for the first time in 17 years. The judge looked up, not at me, at Benjamin. "Mr. Foster," she said slowly, "are you aware of a document filed with this court under the name Whitfield Family Trust?" Benjamin's smile disappeared like a light going out in a house from the outside. "What?" he said. I sat very still, my hands folded, and I felt something settle in my chest that I hadn't felt in years. Not triumph exactly, something quieter than that, something closer to peace. But to understand why I gave away everything I built, why I sat in that courtroom and let my husband believe he had won, you have to go back. Not to this morning, not even to this year, but nearly 3 years earlier. To a letter from a bank I was never supposed to see. and a promise my grandfather made me long before I understood what it would cost or what it would save. People always ask how a marriage gets from the beginning to the end, as if there's one moment you could point to, one door that's slammed. There isn't. There's only a long hallway of small doors closing one after another so quietly you don't notice until you turn around and realize you're standing in the dark. I met Benjamin Foster when I was 24, fresh out of my CPA certification, working 60-hour weeks at a mid-sized accounting firm in Charlotte. He was 26, driving a pickup truck with a cracked windshield and a business card he'd printed himself at a copy shop, Foster Construction, reliable work, fair prices. He had 2 employees, both cousins, and a used cement mixer he was still paying off. He had dust on his boots and a way of looking at you like you were the only person in the room. And I fell for that look before I fell for anything else about him. We got married 18 months later in my parents' backyard, folding chairs and string lights. And within a year I was doing his books at the kitchen table after my own shift ended. I set up his invoicing system. I filed for his contractor's license renewal 3 years running because he kept missing the deadline. I negotiated with his first bank for a line of credit when he didn't have the collateral to qualify on his own. Walking in with a binder of projections I'd built myself, wearing my one good blazer, talking numbers to a loan officer who kept looking past me to Benjamin like he expected the real answers to come from him. I was the one who understood cash flow. Benjamin understood concrete and framing and how to read a room full of subcontractors, which mattered, which I never denied mattered. But a company doesn't survive on framing alone. It survives on the person keeping the lights on when a client is 60 days late paying an invoice. The person managing payroll during the slow winter months. The person who says no to the truck he wanted to buy because the numbers didn't support it yet. That person was me, for almost a decade. Unpaid, unlisted, unnamed on anything but the tax returns. Then the twins came. I remember holding Ethan in one arm and Emma in the other, in the hospital, exhausted in a way I didn't know a body could survive, and Benjamin standing in the doorway on his phone, already talking to a supplier about a project timeline. I didn't resent it then. I told myself that was just who he was, a man who couldn't sit still. A man whose mind was always 3 steps ahead. I went home, I nursed 2 Barbies through the night, and slowly, without ever deciding to, I stopped going into the office. The company grew without me touching the books directly because by then, Benjamin had hired an actual bookkeeper, a woman named Karen, who called him visionary in emails I sometimes saw over his shoulder. He started getting written up in the regional business journal. Foster Construction founder turns family business into regional powerhouse. I read that article standing at the kitchen counter with baby food on my sleeve, and nowhere in 4 columns of print was my name mentioned. Not once, not even in passing. It didn't happen all at once, the distance. It happened in layers. He started coming home later, always with a reason, always with a client dinner or a permitting issue that needed his attention. He started making decisions about money without mentioning them to me first. Decisions I only discovered when statements arrived in the mail. He opened accounts I didn't know about. He stopped asking what I thought. Diane didn't help. She'd come for Sunday dinners and talk about Benjamin's success like it had sprung fully formed from his own 2 hands, like he'd built an empire out of nothing but grit and God-given talent. My son built all of this himself, she said once, swirling wine in her glass, glancing at me like I was the help who'd wandered too close to the good china. I didn't correct her, I never corrected her. I told myself it didn't matter, that the truth didn't need an audience to still be true. I stayed quiet through most of it. That was who I was, who I'd always been, a woman who watched more than she spoke, who believed that dignity meant not making a scene, even as the scene built itself around me brick by brick. Then on a Tuesday afternoon in early autumn 3 years ago, I was sorting mail at the kitchen island, mostly bills and school flyers, when I found an envelope from a bank I didn't recognize. Addressed to Benjamin, marked personal and confidential in red ink. I almost set it aside. I almost let it sit on his desk unopened like 100 other envelopes before it. I didn't. I opened it instead. And what I found inside would not just change how I saw my marriage. It would change everything I thought I understood about the life I'd spent 20 years quietly building for a man who no longer remembered I'd built it with him. The letter inside that envelope wasn't from a bank at all. It was a confirmation notice from a private wealth management firm in Boston, addressed to Benjamin, referencing an account restructuring that had already been completed. I read it twice before the words made sense, and then a third time before the sick feeling in my stomach fully arrived. Benjamin had moved money, significant money, into a series of holding entities I'd never heard of. LLCs with names like Meridian Holdings and Ashford Capital Partners, entities that existed, as far as I could tell, purely to separate assets from the marriage on paper, long before any divorce had ever been mentioned. I didn't confront him that night. I sat with it instead, the way I'd learned to sit with most things, turning it over in my mind while I made dinner and helped Emma with a chemistry worksheet and listened to Ethan complain about his coach. I called an old colleague from my accounting days, a forensic auditor named Priya, who owed me a favor from years back. And I asked her carefully, hypothetically, what it would mean if a business owner started restructuring assets while his wife had no idea it was happening. It means, Priya said, he's either protecting himself from a lawsuit or he's protecting himself from you. I already knew which one it was. Over the following weeks, I pulled at threads quietly the way I used to trace discrepancies in a ledger, never announcing what I was looking for, just following the numbers until they told me the truth. Benjamin had begun the process 18 months earlier, not long after Diane started introducing him at parties, as practically a free man now that the kids are almost grown. He'd been having an affair for nearly a year with a woman named Kristen from his supplier's sales team. Though I didn't have proof of that yet, only a feeling I'd been swallowing for months. The kind of feeling a wife develops when she stops being asked where she wants to go to dinner. I sat with the betrayal longer than I want to admit. There were nights I cried in the bathroom with the fan running so the kids wouldn't hear. And nights I didn't cry at all, just lay awake calculating. The accountant in me refusing to let the wife in me fall apart completely. I kept thinking about the years I'd spent building his company from a truck and a dream into something written up in business journals. Years he was now quietly making sure I'd have no legal claim to. It was during one of those sleepless nights that I remembered my grandfather. Walter Whitfield had been a quiet man, a retired attorney who spent his last 15 years fishing on a lake in Michigan and reading paperback westerns on his porch. When he died, I was 28, newly married, still believing wholeheartedly in the life I was building. He'd left me something in his will, a trust, funded modestly at the time with some stock and a small parcel of land, structured as what his own attorney had called an irrevocable trust. I remembered signing paperwork at his lawyer's office, half listening, distracted by a phone call from Benjamin about a supplier issue. I remembered my grandfather squeezing my hand afterward and saying something I hadn't thought about in years. This isn't for the good years, Natalie. This is for if the bad ones come. I hadn't looked at that trust paperwork in over a decade. I wasn't even certain I still had it. But something in the back of my mind, some quiet architecture my grandfather had built for me long before I understood I'd need it, told me it mattered now more than it ever had. I found the documents in a fireproof box in the attic, beneath old tax returns and Ethan and Emma's baby books. 41 pages, dense with language I hadn't read since I was a young CPA memorizing estate law for an exam. I called Priya again, and then on her recommendation, an estate attorney named Olivia Hart, a woman with silver hair and a reputation for being unshakable in a courtroom. Olivia read through the trust for nearly 2 hours in her office while I sat across from her, watching her expression shift from professional neutrality into something sharper. "Do you understand what your grandfather built for you?" she finally asked. I told her I understood the basics, stocks, some land, a modest inheritance. "It's grown," she said, "substantially. And more importantly, it's structured so that it activates fully, distributing the entirety of its holdings to you if you cease to hold a majority interest in marital assets. Your grandfather built a contingency, Natalie. He built it assuming a day might come when you had nothing left in your own name." I sat very still, the way I had learned to sit still through so much of my marriage. Except this time it wasn't grief keeping me quiet. It was the slow dawning shape of something else entirely. Something that felt less like fear and more, for the first time in years, like the ground shifting firmly back beneath my feet. Benjamin had spent 18 months making sure I would leave our marriage with nothing. He had no idea that leaving with nothing was about to make me wealthier than he had ever imagined possible. Olivia Hart did not like my plan. She told me so plainly, sitting across from me in her office with the trust documents spread between us like a hand of cards, only I understood how to play. "You could fight for half of everything," she said. "The house, the business valuation, the investment accounts. Given what he's done, moving assets without disclosure, a judge would not look kindly on him. You could walk away with millions, Natalie, and still keep your trust untouched. Why would you give up a fight you're likely to win? I understood her confusion. On paper, it made no sense. I could have hired a forensic accountant to trace every dollar Benjamin had moved, dragged the affair into discovery. Spent 2 years in litigation, bleeding him financially and emotionally, the way he'd apparently been prepared to bleed me. Olivia had built her entire career on exactly that kind of fight, and she was good at it. Better than good. But I didn't want his money. I wanted something he couldn't calculate, couldn't see coming, couldn't prepare a defense against because he wouldn't even know it existed until it was already his loss. If I fought for half of the marital estate, I'd spend years tied to him through lawyers and appraisals and courtroom dates. And even then, I'd only ever be as wealthy as what he'd built. If I walked away and let the trust do what my grandfather designed it to do, I would be free of him entirely. And wealthier than the business he was so proud of had ever made him. I know this looks like I'm losing my mind, I told Olivia, but I need you to trust me the way I trust what my grandfather built. It took her 3 meetings to come around, and even then I don't think she fully believed I wouldn't change my mind the morning of the hearing. She filed the paperwork my way. She kept the trust notice sealed and separate from the general divorce filing, exactly as the law allowed, ready to be introduced only once the settlement was finalized in court. Once Benjamin's signature was already dry on paper he couldn't take back. At home I told no one, not my sister, not my closest friend from church. Not even Ethan and Emma, though they were old enough to sense something was wrong long before I explained anything. Benjamin, meanwhile, had never been happier. He moved out of the house in November and into a rental downtown he described to Diane as temporary, though I noticed the temporary apartment had art on the walls within 2 weeks. He started appearing at the twins' basketball games with Kristen trailing a few steps behind him, her hand looped through his arm like she'd already measured the drapes for our old living room. He bought a new truck, not because he needed one, but because he could. Because for the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running numbers past me first. Diane took me to lunch once during that period, ostensibly to discuss the kids' college plans, though I understood within the first 10 minutes it was really an audition for her role as the reasonable mother-in-law, helping smooth things along. Benjamin built that company from nothing, she reminded me, stirring sweetener into her iced tea. It wouldn't be fair to tear it apart in court, I'm sure you understand. I told her I did understand more than she knew, and let her interpret that however she wanted. The hardest part wasn't Benjamin. It wasn't even Diane. It was Ethan and Emma watching their mother agree to walk away from the only home they'd ever known without a fight. Watching the divorce papers get signed room by room while their father celebrated like a man who dodged a bullet. Emma found me in the kitchen one night, the lease documents for our future apartment spread across the counter, and she asked the question I could see she'd been holding for weeks. "Mom, why aren't you fighting? Everyone knows what he did, everyone knows about her." I set down my pen and looked at my daughter, 17 years old, already so much sharper than I'd been at that age. And I told her the only truth I could offer without giving away the whole plan. Sometimes winning doesn't look like fighting, Emma. Sometimes it looks like letting someone believe they've already won. She didn't understand. I didn't expect her to, not yet. By the time the court date arrived in early spring, Benjamin had already picked out a ring for Kristen, according to a cousin who still spoke to me out of old loyalty. He'd already started designing an addition to the lake house he was about to own outright. He walked into that courtroom the way a man walks into a party he's certain is being thrown in his honor, straightening his tie, barely glancing at me, already halfway into the rest of his life. He had no idea that the rest of his life was about to look nothing like he'd planned. We're back where this story began, the courtroom smelling of old paper and cheap coffee, Judge Ramirez holding a folder she hadn't expected to open. "Mr. Foster," she said, "are you aware of a document filed with this court under the name Whitfield Family Trust?" Benjamin's face did something I'd never seen it do in 22 years of marriage. It went blank, then confused. Then as the seconds stretched, something close to afraid. "What?" he said again, looking at his attorney, who was already flipping through his own copy of the documents with visibly rising alarm. Olivia stood calm as still water and addressed the court. "Your Honor, this trust was established by Mrs. Foster's late grandfather over 17 years ago. It is an irrevocable trust, fully documented, entirely separate from any marital property. Under both federal and state law, its assets are excluded from the marital estate. We filed formal notice of the trust's existence with this court. though not with opposing counsel, as it was not required for the settlement being entered today, since Mrs. Foster was not seeking any claim against it. Cole Bennett, Benjamin's attorney, was reading faster now, his composure cracking at the edges. Your Honour, if this trust is being activated by the terms of the divorce settlement, we would need time to review. The trust's activation clause, Olivia continued, unbothered, was triggered the moment Mrs. Foster relinquished her interest in the marital assets today, precisely as she has done of her own free will, as this court confirmed just minutes ago. There is nothing to review, Counsellor. It is a private instrument executed independently of these proceedings, and it does not require this court's involvement to take effect. I sat perfectly still through all of it. My hands folded the same way they'd been folded an hour earlier, though something in my chest had loosened like a held breath finally released. I didn't look at Benjamin. I didn't need to. I could feel him staring at me from across the aisle, and in that stare I could hear every question he didn't yet know how to ask. The judge turned back to him. Mr. Foster, I'll ask you directly, were you aware prior to signing today's settlement of the existence or the terms of this trust? Benjamin's mouth opened, closed, opened again. No, he finally said, his voice smaller than I'd ever heard it. I had no idea. Did anyone conceal this information from you? Was it withheld during discovery? Olivia answered before he could. No, Your Honour. This trust was never part of Mrs. Foster's disclosed marital assets because it is not and has never been a marital asset. Mr. Foster was under no obligation to inquire about property belonging separately to his wife, and Mrs. Foster was under no obligation to volunteer information about assets outside the scope of these proceedings. The judge looked between the two of us for a long moment, then down at the documents again. This settlement was entered freely by both parties with full legal counsel, and I see no evidence of fraud or misrepresentation regarding the marital estate itself. The Whitfield Trust is a separate legal matter and falls outside my jurisdiction in this proceeding. She looked at Benjamin, not unkindly, but with the flat clarity of someone stating a fact. Mr. Foster, I understand this is a surprise to you, but surprise is not the same as deception. You signed this agreement with full knowledge of what you were receiving. Mrs. Foster is not required to explain what she already owned. I watched something collapse behind Benjamin's eyes. The particular collapse of a man realizing in real time that the story he'd been telling himself for months was not the story that had actually been happening. He'd walked into that courtroom certain he was the one taking everything. He was only now understanding that certainty had made him careless, and carelessness in the end is its own kind of verdict. Benjamin kept the company. He kept the house, the lake property, the investment accounts, every asset he'd fought so hard to claim. On paper, he'd won everything he'd asked for, but I watched in the months that followed as the cost of that victory revealed itself slowly, the way costs often do. Kristen didn't stay once she understood there wasn't a windfall coming his way. Once she realized the man she'd attached herself to had a mortgage on the lake house he'd bragged about, and a business that, without my quiet management behind it for 2 decades, was already showing cracks in its cash flow that a hired bookkeeper hadn't caught in time. Benjamin had built his identity on being a man who needed nothing and no one. And now, for the first time in his adult life, he was going to find out exactly how much of that identity had been true, and how much of it had simply been me standing quietly behind him, making sure he never had to. I left the courthouse that afternoon without looking back at the building or the man still arguing with his attorney in the hallway. Ethan and Emma were waiting for me in the car, and when I got in, Emma reached over and squeezed my hand without saying anything at all, like she finally understood something she hadn't a few weeks earlier. I drove us home, the late afternoon like gold across the windshield, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, the road ahead didn't feel like something I was enduring. It felt like something that finally, quietly belonged to me. 8 months have passed since that afternoon in the courtroom. Benjamin still has everything he fought so hard to keep. I never went back for any of it. I never wanted to. There's a particular kind of freedom in walking away from a life you built with your hands and letting someone else keep the walls, because walls were never what I was fighting for. The trust began distributing assets almost immediately after the settlement finalized, exactly as my grandfather had designed it to nearly 2 decades earlier. I didn't buy anything extravagant. I found a small house 2 streets back from the beach in a town an hour from where Ethan and Emma grew up, close enough that they could still come home on weekends, far enough that it felt like starting over instead of just moving down the block from my old life. It has a kitchen window that looks out over a garden I'm slowly learning to keep alive. And some mornings I stand there with my coffee and realize I haven't thought about Benjamin at all. Not out of bitterness fadding, but out of a life quietly filling in around me instead. Ethan and Emma both got into good colleges. Emma wants to study finance, which made me laugh the first time she told me, standing in my new kitchen with her acceptance letter in hand, though I don't think she fully understood why until I explained a little more about her great-grandfather and the trust he'd built for a granddaughter he never lived to see need it. Benjamin reached out a few times over the summer. Nothing dramatic, mostly logistics about the kids' move-in dates. But one evening in July, he called about something else entirely. I could hear it in his voice before he even said it, that particular unsteadiness of a man who'd spent months turning something over in his mind and finally decided to say it out loud. "You could have told me," he said, "about the trust before any of this happened." I stood on my porch watching the last of the light fade over the water 2 streets away. And I thought about how many years I'd spent waiting for him to ask me a real question, any real question, about who I was or what I carried, or what I'd built quietly beside him while he collected the credit. "You never asked," I said. There was a long pause on the line, the kind that used to make me anxious back when I still needed his silences to mean something reassuring. It didn't anymore. "So this was revenge," he said finally, not quite a question. "No," I told him, and I meant it more fully than I think he'll ever understand. "I didn't do any of this to hurt you, Benjamin. I simply stopped protecting you from your own greed. What happened after that was never mine to control." He didn't have a response for that. We hung up a few minutes later, polite in the way 2 people can be polite once the fighting is finally gone out of them. And I sat on my porch a while longer, listening to the sound of the water I couldn't quite see from there but could always hear. People ask me sometimes if I regret not fighting harder in that courtroom, not taking half of everything I helped build over 22 years. I tell them the truth. I didn't lose that fight. I simply chose a different one. There's a version of strength that looks like clenched fists and courtroom battles. And there's another version that looks like quietly signing your name, walking out the door, and trusting that the things worth having were never the things anyone could take from you in the first place. My grandfather understood that. It took me most of my adult life to understand it too. If you're sitting somewhere right now feeling like you've lost everything to someone who never truly saw what you were worth, I want you to hear this. Sometimes the bravest thing you can do isn't fighting for what's yours. It's trusting that what's truly yours was never something they could take.